Pre-5, we're good.
Okay, yeah.
All right. Well, let me begin and welcome everybody to the Student Affairs and Student Life Committee. And so with me here, I'm the chair, Enrique Cerna. Rep Blankenship is committee member, and Shane Wright, also committee member. Welcome. So first thing we're going to hear about today is the system-wide mental health support for students, Washington Student Achievement Council grant. And is it both going to present? I can't remember.
I'm starting and
Okay.
I'm picking up the first part.
All right.
Yep.
Yeah, oh, that's
All right.
right, yes.
You're throwing the first pitch and she's the closer?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I got Dominic.
Okay, cool.
Thank you, Regent Cerna. Let me just, for the record, just sort of starting for anyone who may be watching on live stream, I'm Ellen Taylor. I'm currently serving as the interim vice president for student affairs. I'm going to talk a little bit about the system-wide mental health support for students, some of the newer initiatives that we have in place. So I'm not doing a broad overview of everything that's in place at each of the campuses and so on, but in some ways this is a response to a question that you asked at the September meeting, Regent Wright, around conversations between university administration and students around last year's or this year's, I guess, tuition increase and the commitment to dedicate some of those dollars to student mental health initiatives. And I know you'd asked a question about that last time, and I said, let's get back to you all on that. So that's really the impetus for my part of this presentation, is to get back to you all about those conversations. So there's a couple things, and I think we can go to the next. Jill, do you have it? So let me talk. So there's really two things that we're doing that are, one that's sort of old but expanded, and I want to talk about that, and then something else that we have used some dollars to address. The first is upgrading our protocol membership and expanding it to all campuses. Let me talk a little bit. I knew this would happen. I've got some notes on my phone, and it keeps going to, it goes to sleep after a while if I don't touch it or whatever. But so protocol is a product that is, it's a third-party product that we've had a contract with on a couple of our campuses. And you'll see 4 icons up there. The after-hours crisis services is sort of the core element. So it's really like a 24/7 crisis line. Student can call and talk to somebody about if they are experiencing depression or anxiety or whatever it is that they're experiencing. They feel like they need to talk to someone. The wonderful thing about protocol is that then the company loops back with the mental health care providers or the care providers on the campus to sort of close the loop on that conversation. And this emerged sort of as a product that a long time ago you would have especially if you had an off-campus crisis line, student would call and talk to someone, but those of us on campus who are engaged in supporting students and making sure that they have what they need wouldn't know anything about it. And it can lead to some real gaps in care. And so protocol is something that a couple of our campuses have worked with to fight. And what we're doing, we got using some of those dollars, we've gotten a commitment from central administration to support protocol for all of our campuses. And at the same time, what we're doing is expanding to something that's called Protocol Plus. And so you'll see the other 3 things that are up there: the peer support moderated and trained by trained practitioners, the digital self-help tools, and a global referral network. Those are all elements that are a part of it's sort of a suite of services. They call it an ecosystem of support that we will now have available on all of our campuses. And I think I really highlight global because I think there's elements of this that are particularly important for our global campus. So we're adding the peer support, and this is really, there are sort of online support groups so students can access other students and have conversations. Those are moderated by trained practitioners, which is really important when you've got young people that are engaging with each other around what they're experiencing. You want someone who has that training to be able to watch that to make sure and, either intervene if someone seems to be spiraling out of control, and we want to make sure we get them connected up with local resources. That's where the global referral network comes in. It's one of the places it comes in. That global referral network can be used either by students or by practitioners to find resources where the student is. Maybe a student's going home for summer and they need help finding support in where they're going to be for the summer. Or if they're a global student, they can be anywhere. And we want to make sure that we can help them find resources if they want in-person contact with someone where they are. The digital self-help tools, this is really mostly cognitive behavioral therapy-based self-help tools that students can use their phones and access. They can set up different ways of engaging with it. It can be reminders. So if they know that one of the things they need is a reminder a couple times a day to pause, to do some of that good positive self-talk, to remind themselves that they're, whatever it is they need to remind themselves of, using that cognitive behavioral therapy framework, they can access that and they can set it up in a way that meets their individual needs. So we are hoping to have this in place January. We're engaging with the company around expanding the contract we already have in place and sort of negotiating some of that with them. And so hoping January, but certainly at some point during spring semester, we'll have that available. Sorry. Last thing that is mine, and then we'll go on to the next one. I want to be sure I answer any questions folks have. The other thing that we did with some of the dollars that are coming in terms of the revenue stream from tuition dollars, essentially last year, of course, in the pandemic, there were budget reductions, really in many, many departments, and certainly student affairs, and this is on the Pullman campus that I'm talking about now, was one of them. We engaged with Office of Administration and Finance around that, and they restored some of those budget reductions for the Division of Student Affairs. And some of those dollars, and this was part of the negotiation of if you will restore these dollars from the central fund, one of the things we will do is focus on equity and retention salary increases for our mental health providers and our disability access advisors on the Pullman campus. This is critical because, and this is true in a lot of areas, but Pullman in particular has struggled to recruit and retain mental health counselors. I've been here at WSU now going on 4 years, and we have not yet ever had every position that we have funded filled. And so we are always sort of behind the 8 ball, trying to catch up and trying to make sure we are adequately staffed in terms of providing those resources. We did some research and the salaries, we have sort of a salary matrix that we use. The salaries of our mental health counselors were drastically behind the national average. I'll use a little story. The team was trying to recruit someone and actually lost them to University of Idaho, which is 8 miles away. And University of Idaho was paying their starting mental health counselors 14% more than we were. That's just math. You're fresh out of graduate school, you've got student loans, you're looking at wanting to buy a house, getting started financially. We have an amazing benefits package, but your average new professional cares less about the benefits package than they care about what are you actually going to put in my bank account every month so that I can pay off my loans and start to think about taking on a mortgage, those kinds of things. It's just where they are in their thinking. So we were able to address that, and I think we're actually in a much better place now, and I think we will be much more effective at recruiting and retaining our mental health counselors. Same with the disability access advisors, the ones who are working. I put that here because I think you can stop and think, well, that's not a mental health support, but actually many of the students who use our disability access services have a mental health condition as their disability. And so there's a very strong connection between our mental health counselors and our disability access advisors. They work together really closely to support students. Questions?
How many students, numbers of students that access, do we know that?
I'm sorry?
The number of students that access the mental health, like, that are seeking help.
I don't know a number right off the top of my head. Nationally speaking, at most campuses, it is in the territory of 12 to 15% of the student body will seek mental health services on campus in any given year. A couple things about that. One of the things that we don't know how many may seek services off campus, and they do that sort of on their own or whatever. One of the things that's great about some of the ecosystem of support that Protocol will offer is one of the things we know is there are many students who actually won't go to the mental health service on campus for a variety of reasons. There is still a stigma attached to it. May depend a lot on their own sort of family background, their cultural background, all of the assumptions that can go into what does it mean for me to seek help. Even students with different majors are disparately likely to seek help. And so what this does is provide us some additional services that they can access without necessarily going in person to meet with a counselor if they're feeling nervous about doing that. So we have a generation of students right now who the stigma around mental health seeking, if you look at the whole generation, the stigma has reduced. They're a sort of generation of students whose parents use counseling and so on. And that said, that doesn't tell the whole story because there are still many communities for which seeking mental health services is just absolutely taboo. So this gives us some multiple tools.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you know anything, how long has protocol been used on the Pullman campus?
That's a really good question, and I do not know the answer to it. I'm going to say probably going on half a dozen years.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been there for a while.
Do you know anything about the utilization of it on the Pullman campus? I'm just curious as I'm thinking about it being expanded broadly.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, what your question would be is how many students are calling the after hours crisis,
Right.
because that's really been that's the service that's been in place. And so, and I don't know, that's the one that's been in place. The other stuff is what we're adding.
I see.
Yeah. So I can get that information in terms of how many students use the 24/7 line. Jill, do you know?
I don't know, but I will mention that this is part of a suite of after-hours care that's available to
Yes.
students.
Right.
This is one of the many options. So, for example, if a student lives in a residence hall on the Pullman campus, they may seek after-hours support from their resident advisor, who is a peer-to-peer mentor, or from their residence education director, who is a professional master's degree educated live-in staff member. And then we also run a 24 hours a day being on call phone where someone can reach me or someone designated by me if there's an emergency that's happening. So this is a great tool because we've heard continually from our students, especially that are not located in Pullman, they need an option, and this helps us with that option.
How do we compare to other schools in providing services for mental health?
You mean in terms of the resources that we have in place to provide to students?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I think actually going through some of the stuff that Jill just talked about, I think we look a lot like most other schools. There's sort of a pretty standard set of things to have in place. I think we're probably understaffed, and some of that, one of the things I have been saying is I don't want to advocate for new mental health positions, for example, until we go through a year or two with all the ones we have filled.
Right.
And so I think, I can say we're understaffed, but part of that is because we have had trouble recruiting and retaining
Right.
those counselors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just seems that now that this is more of a, it would seem to me students would be more open to seek some help now.
Yeah.
But then again, I don't know,
Yeah.
the stigma regarding mental health
Yeah.
is just so strong.
Yeah.
That it's tough.
I do think like I said, overall, I think they're more willing to seek help. The
Right.
pandemic provided us with an interesting opportunity. One of the things that we are doing now is certainly providing that in-person support, but also adding TeleMental Health as an element. We did that during the pandemic thinking, it's so interesting. We've been having conversations about that probably for years, and that, as we all know, institutions change slowly, and mental health is, as a sort of profession, also changes slowly. When the pandemic hit, we pivoted like that. Suddenly in 2 weeks, we were providing HIPAA compliant mental health care via Zoom. One of the things we learned is that for some students, they actually preferred that. And it speaks to the stigma that you were just mentioning.
Right.
For some students, it means they can try it out without having to go and sit in a room in person with someone, or without having to risk their friends seeing them go into the space and making assumptions. And so we're right now continuing to offer that as one option for students if they say, I would prefer to be seen, at least initially, via Zoom and HIPAA compliant Zoom. We make that available for them. And so we're still learning about that, and again, nationally paying attention to that. But that was a surprise, that was, I think, a gift of the pandemic, was it actually altered our thinking a little bit about that.
And anecdotally in that space, we're also hearing, anecdotally from students that, maybe I don't feel like I can get out of bed today because I'm struggling with depression.
Right.
But I can turn my phone on and talk to my mental health provider. And that's been a real gift for students that are in that position. We're also seeing a surge of private party mental health providers through telehealth coming out through like podcast ads and things. So between all of that, I think it's shifting towards becoming an expectation that this is an available service for students.
Right.
And I'll speak to camps like ours where many of our students are older and have full-time jobs. And so when you're talking about how we pivoted during this pandemic and things that we're implementing for, from now on to more, is the idea that things are not bound by 8 to 5 and that I can shift my staff's hours from 10 to 7 one day a week. And now that full-time employee on a Tuesday can now get their counseling appointment at 5:30. And my staff isn't leaving campus at 7 p.m. at night in the dark, rather they are remote on that particular day. And so really responding to the students' need and what they became acclimated to, and then also being aware of that group that we missed for so many years and just having this idea that we're 8 to 5 and 5 o'clock is
Right.
it. And to those parents and to many others who struggle in that way, this is right out of work, get home. I've now got my appointment, or I do it in my car before I get in to deal with the kids and everything else and the noise and get that privacy. This is something that we're seeing our students respond to, and it was something I am shameful I should have came up with when I got here, like, why aren't we doing this?
Right.
Knowing our population, but it just took a pandemic to really step back and think, how are we serving those populations that have always existed on our campuses that we just missed?
Well, it's a flexibility, and it's also, I think a lot of people have had to learn to come up with different alternatives during the pandemic. To be honest, I think that I've had a battle with depression for a long time, and during the years that it was the worst. And initially, I had real issues with the stigma. I was so afraid of anybody knowing that I had a problem. And, I would have loved to have had an opportunity I was stuck a lot of times between the office hours, and particularly when I was having a crisis. And, and then you can't do anything because they wouldn't take your call.
Yeah.
So I think this is tremendous.
And we're focused on students clearly in this committee, but when you think about what it means for staff and their mental health, and responding to the Great Resignation. And so now I have staff that I can rotate and they can say, I can spend that morning with my kids, getting them ready for school or what have you, and just shift the schedule out and then work remote in that way. And so we're kind of addressing both of these in a unique way and trying to serve students with some longevity and consistency of staff, but also responding to the needs of students as the primary.
That same shift has happened with non-clinical mental health support as well. So the clinical components are happening through counseling and psychological services and through protocol plus and things like that. We've shifted the office hours for the Office of the Dean of Students as well, so students can reach emergency funding and a number of other things between 5 and 7 p.m. Monday through Thursday. So different options. Those are only Zoom hours, but we're trying to make sure that we reach the students that have jobs, that have family obligations, and then also have classes that are simply, different schedules than a university administrator's traditional hours.
Do you know, so when we're talking about Pullman using some of those returned funds, do you know has anything similar been done on like Vancouver campus in terms of, I think that across the board salary and like competitive salary can be a challenge in retention for staff in general. And then I'm thinking of some of that intersectionality regarding race and ethnicity on the Vancouver campus or really on any campus, and that competitive wage can be one part of that complex puzzle. I just was curious if you have any insight on that.
I would say that the difficulty of finding counselors of color, in particular of African descent, that has been a struggle in this field for some time.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the racial inequities in terms of pay, hard to see, and at least on our campus, I'll speak to, and I would say even within the region, because there are so few.
Yeah.
And so that as you look at gender added in there as well, and other intersectionality and identities, much more difficult in terms of that pay. I think in terms of gender, what we found is that flexibility in scheduling and being able to offer a different type of employment in that way has been responded to. And there's a lot more studies done right now on the faculty side, but you can really use it as a proxy for many other aspects. And that gender piece has been something that has been prominent in that. So less about the pay in that way. And ours is funded slightly different through S&A funds. And so any kind of pay adjustments and what have you would be done through that on this particular campus.
See some of the statistics that were asked about.
Curious.
Actually,
Can send you some of the statistics for cap usage.
oh,
Are we running over on time?
No, we just got the
No.
information that you had asked about. So.
yeah, so one of my colleagues actually just sent me some information in response. She's watching from her office back in Pullman. And so she texted me some information, which I'll share with you. In 2018-19, so pre-pandemic, 2,021 students accessed the counseling and psychological services. 2021, that number stayed pretty consistent. So it means they're serving about 10% of the Pullman population. And that fits right with what I was drawing from was my knowledge of national data, and it's right in that sort of ballpark, 10 to 15%.
Just a question, so for 21, it was pretty level. I'm just seeing if there's a correlation with problems dealing with the pandemic. We're not really through the pandemic, but we should be through shutdowns and things. We should be away from the isolation that might contribute to some of the other issues.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see is, one of the things we've talked about with the pandemic is, and I don't have data around this at present, because as you say, we're sort of emerging from it, we're sort of not. But one of the things, and again, going back to the disparate impact on students, but certainly anecdotally, what we have heard is that it was, we all know the isolation was tremendously impactful for students. I am so glad we were able to continue to provide services using Zoom so that students, regardless of where they were, could access that. The fact that the numbers stayed level, even though we only had, at the Pullman campus, we had, fewer than 1,000 students living in the residence halls. We don't know how many students were in town exactly, but certainly a far smaller number than this year, for example. All of the preliminary data suggests that the sort of what I've called the mental health impact tail of the pandemic is going to be long. And so it's not just once we're able to kind of get back to normal that the impact will stop happening. And one of that is, I know Jill has pointed out in a couple conversations we've had this year on campus, we have only actually one class, if I get this right, one class of students, undergraduates, who have actually had a whole year on campus in person ever before.
Just our seniors.
Well, that's
Just our seniors.
I was about gonna lead into that, because we're gonna have an interesting study here, since 2019 was disrupted. 2020 was a pandemic year. So in 21, that means the only class that has had campus life is the seniors.
Right.
So it's like you have 3 years of freshmen on campus all at once.
Yeah. Our juniors got
So
3/4 of a year about, but yeah.
So the mental health bump of the excitement of being together again might be what's keeping your numbers level. And then,
Right, almost like an artificial, yeah.
And at the same time, we're looking at a societal collective trauma, right? And so when we look at individual mental health support options, we really are looking at individuals. And so there's also another element in student life overall of collective care for our community, both for students, faculty, and staff. Because ultimately we can't, it would be ineffective to individually counsel each student through the trauma of the pandemic instead of looking at the impact as a whole, because I think we're all feeling it to some degree in our lives. Doesn't matter if it's, in your job or in your personal life or, in your conversations with friends and family. Everyone felt some level of isolation and some level of resiliency and some level of recovery. And some of us have done that at different rates than others.
Because it seemed to me to be tangible, being on campus in September, when the excitement actually being on campus, being in class. I don't know if you felt that here or not, but it was exciting. It was genuinely really exciting.
So when we're talking about, we're just talking about, are there any services provided in Vancouver and Everett and Tri-City?
Yes, we have both in-person and remote. And I wanted to throw in here our global students accessing care. So when we talk about students who are 2 hours ahead or 3 hours behind in Hawaii, they're all over. And so something like this and allowing them to have access to what are not normal, it's not business hours of the campus, it's really impactful. And so our numbers here, and I can put a report out to this group, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, clearly a significant reduction in the use of services this past year. And while we've seen some of it rise this year, I think it's an interesting assessment of mitigating some of that mental health with coming back together. At the same time, there's a small group with severe anxiety about coming back together.
Yeah.
So there's a balance there, and then you have to take into consideration some reduction in overall enrollment, because forever we've lost a portion of our students. There's a portion of our students that anti-mandate and say I'm never coming back, and there's a certain amount of students that came because of the mandate. So there's this balance we have to put in all of our numbers of what we do and say, yes, there's a reduction, but what is the reduction of overall enrollment? And then take into consideration that not all of our students are taking in-person classes and this bump in global enrollment. And what does that do to all of our campuses? Folks who are in Pullman but have said, hey, don't want to go into a full classroom, so even mask, or I can't breathe in a mask, whatever it may be, so I'm going to move to global. So there's all of these things we have to calibrate in looking at our numbers for this academic year, and there are dissertations galore available with the data that we're collecting right now and reviewing on this. So we're still in the midst of it and still trying to assess what this means. But programs like this are going to be essential and expected moving forward. So while this is a seed and something new, we're going to look back in 5 years and we're going to get a student say, why would I go to your campus unless you have this?
Right.
This is now the standard. And so we are leaning into it and moving forward, but this will be old hat come 2025, and it'll just be what is.
And I can speak to the other, absolutely everything that Dominic just said, and I can speak, there are some services provided on each of our campuses with the exception of global. For example, Everett contracts with a local counselor who comes in for a certain number of hours each week to provide individual counseling. That's true on other campuses. I will say that some of this identification of protocol plus and the idea of doing that at a system-wide level came out of a task force actually that I had sort of convened pre-pandemic, looking at the fact that the level and the degree and the capacity in terms of mental health services on your campuses it's not equal across the system. And we were really looking at, can we leverage the 35,000 students instead of each campus piecing together for themselves? Is there a way to leverage the system with, and at that point, again, this was pre-pandemic, and then through the pandemic, we were looking at, there are companies that, like Joe was talking about, like BetterHelp is one that you hear a lot of, and other things that really what they do is telehealth and telemental health, and that's what they do. And so they have solved some of the issues that have to do with global, that has to do with licensure across state lines and kind of some of those things that can make it complicated to provide services to students who may be in another state. And if I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of Washington, I can't provide services to someone who lives outside of the state of Washington or who's located outside the state of Washington. I mean, I can on a brief period of time, but so there's all those kinds of things. So we were looking at that. I think it's something that we will continue to explore. The price tag on that gets very significant. The idea of providing access to better health for all of our students across the system, we start getting into a very large price tag. That's not a reason to not keep pursuing it. We will continue looking at that, but that's gonna take some time to piece together. This felt like a really good outcome of that work to say, here's something that every COOB can have access to regardless of where they're enrolled. And it's sort of filling some of those gaps. And on each campus, adding to what's already in place for our global students, this will be the start of building access for them. Yeah.
I agree with the point though, that there are gonna be parents and students kind of, okay, it's almost like you have a student rec center, what's the quality of that? But you're looking for, if you've got an issue, and you gotta, you're looking for something on campus. So.
And there's a challenge embedded in that. I think that's absolutely true. And we've seen that growing over the last, decade of kind of, what are you doing for my son or daughter relating to mental health? I think we always have to remind ourselves that while it is critical and it will be expected and it needs to be built in that we're providing mental health support and lots of student care, I think we always have to remember that we cannot meet all students,
Right.
all of every student's mental health needs. We are an education institution and our mission is to educate, and there will be students whose needs exceed our capacity and probably even our appropriate role in terms of providing them with the care that they may need. And so I just say that because I think I've had that conversation with various parents over the course of my career around kind of where's the limit of what we can provide for a student. I use as one example a student I talked to a couple of years ago who said, I think I should be able to have free mental health counseling every week for the whole time I'm enrolled in college. And it's beyond our capacity
Right.
financially.
Mhm.
I think it also stops being, this is about supporting students and it
Right.
is also about supporting their academic success.
Mhm.
And that's sort of, I think, what has to drive this. It's about health and safety, and it is about making sure that they have what they need to be able to stay in school, to persist, to succeed. We can't be the fix for everything. So.
I agree.
All
Very
right.
good.
Well, we have a little bit more
Okay.
in the fundamental needs support area. So I realize I didn't introduce myself. I believe I've met everyone, but for the folks on Zoom, Dr. Jill Clayton, I use she, hers pronouns. My role is Associate Vice President of Student Affairs and Dean of Students and Deputy Title IX Coordinator. So I work with initiatives primarily on the Pullman campus, but initiatives across the system, particularly when it comes to student well-being and fundamental needs. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Thomas to kick us off, and then I'll talk a little bit more in a bit.
And I apologize for not introducing myself either, just began yapping. Dominic Thomas, any and all pronouns, Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs and Enrollment and Deputy Title IX Coordinator here at WSU Vancouver. And I had the pleasure of, and still enjoy the pleasure of serving as PI with Dr. Creighton on the Supporting Students Experiencing Homelessness pilot grant. I was looking up to figure out what the name of the Senate bill was. It's SB 1166, which created some dollars to fund this program from our state legislature. And WSAC is the agency that received the funds and is the distributor. And this was an area that prior to the pandemic was of interest to all of us in supporting our students. And so just to give you some background in searching for grants and trying to problem solve, we've long had a Kuba food pantry on many of the campuses around the system and serving our students of this incredible need around food insecurity. There are other levels of insecurity that students experience in fundamental needs, and we were trying to address those and seeking grants to help fill in the gaps. So this was one that had come up, and it was a pilot for 2-year institutions, but they allowed 3 4-year institutions for the first year, had a 1-year review and opened it up to several others. We were identified and acquired the grant in part because of our unique system approach. And so we are the only campus and only system, that is a recipient of the grant. And so the information we provided in our submission of the grant, we utilized what's called the Real College Survey. And this is something that was implemented in 2019, so pre-pandemic. So understanding that this was a concern then, and likely even more so afterwards as we talk about the eviction moratoriums ending, reduction in employment, all of these things that have gone on and will continue to change. But some of the data out of that for our systems that were polled in 2019, system students, over 4,000 responses out of the 30,000. And we had 53% of our students experience some form of basic needs insecurity. That included 28% food insecurity, 43% experiencing others, including homelessness or experiencing a loss of housing in some way, shape, or form. Additionally, Senate Bill 1166 incorporates the support of what they call former foster youth or aged out foster youth. Many different terminologies, but I'm just using the one that's in the Senate bill. And we have a passport program within our system that serves those students as well. So they are another group that is able to qualify for the use of some of these funds. And so they've been great partners, WSAC and our legislature, in broadly defining housing insecurity and experiencing homelessness or on the verge of homelessness. And so this grant of $93,000 a year, it's not a ton of money, but money that we're appreciative to have and our students are appreciative to have. And we've looked at how the needs of each campus and pocket of students that we could serve uniquely. And in the form, and I'll let Dr. Creighton get into some of the ways that we're doing that in distribution, but I just wanted to provide the background as to how this came to be, the amount. It's a 2-year grant, $93,000 a year, and us coming into it with this broader plan of how do we address some of the fundamental needs of students, and knowing that we have had some plans in place, and I'll let Dr. Creighton talk about some of the positions and expanding food pantry support, but this grant is intended and was intended and will continue to be intended to support some of those broader efforts. But I wanted to provide just a sense of how we got into this grant, why we applied, and the uniqueness of taking these dollars and then trying to say, how do we meet the needs on each campus and each population?
Thank you. A few other things on this. The college student population that is experiencing fundamental needs insecurity is a largely invisible population. And that's why it's so hard to serve students in this space, because they have to self-identify. This is not something we can find through a statistic or even through a FAFSA family contribution number or something like that. Students who struggle with fundamental needs often come from middle-class backgrounds as well, and maybe they don't have family support. Our students who are struggling in this area are often couch surfing between friends, and they might spend a couple of weeks on one friend's couch and then another. And so again, very hard to self-identify, and they have good access to hygiene elements such as showers and things like that inside of our recreational facilities. So what we're hoping to do is be able to serve more students who will then come forward with some level of expressed need. But houselessness is a really big challenge, especially in urban institutional environments across the country. And we've kind of lived with a very dangerous narrative of the quote unquote poor starving college student for a long time. People have probably made jokes about, eating mac and cheese and ramen and things like that. And our messaging here is that those things aren't amusing. Not being able to meet your fundamental needs is not something that any of our college students should have to live with, because you can't learn if your brain is not fed. If you're worried about where your next meal is coming from or where you're going to sleep that night, you certainly cannot engage the critical thinking parts of your brain to think about deep philosophy or scientific experiment or any of the other things that are going to help you persist to the end of your degree. So this is really, at the end of the day, not only a human fundamental need, it's also a retention effort on behalf of the institution. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're actually going to do with this money that we received from the Washington State Achievement Council. The first is we are going to be funding a professional staff position called the Fundamental Needs Manager. And this person will be serving the WSU system to help coordinate the elements of the grant. Actually, Mondo Antonino, who's sitting here with us, is serving on that search committee. So thank you, Mondo, for being willing to do that. And we also have a well-rounded committee from across the system. We're going to be trying a peer-to-peer approach, which we are the only ones in the state trying this. So we'll see how it goes. We're very optimistic. But our goal is to hire peer navigators who will teach other students how to do things like sign up for SNAP benefits, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Or they might be able to help connect someone with a shelter and a place to stay. Or just help that student be able to express their needs, because sometimes it's easier in a peer-to-peer environment than it is in an administrator-to-peer environment or administrator-to-student environment. We're looking to use the grant funding to supplement needs all sorts of ways with fundamental houselessness concerns, such as storage units that might be temporary, or moving expenses, again, could be temporary. Houselessness support kits, which could be something like access to clean sheets or laundry. That's a very critical need. Or temporary support with utility bills. Short-term housing resources are very scarce in the Pullman community, and they look very different in the Tri-Cities than they do from Spokane, as they do from Yakima, as they do from Vancouver and Everett, et cetera. And especially in our Puyallup and Skagit Valley Extension research locations and Wenatchee locations, it's just very disparate. So we're hoping that the fundamental needs manager might be able to initiate some MOUs with local hotels to help our students get back on their feet if they're experiencing housing insecurity. And then also things like gas or bus cards. We have students who need to be able to get to class. If you are here in the Vancouver community, you don't have a lot of public transportation options to get here. And if you have a vehicle but you don't have money to put gas in your vehicle, especially with, summa cum laude gas out here, it's like $3.79 a gallon. We need to.
That's cheap.
Summa cum laude gas. I've seen the joke. We need academic probation level of gas. So the reality is that the problem is our students can't afford to get to school, and so if they can't afford to get to school, they're not going to be able to learn. So we want to be able to put many, many different safety nets in place, and Dr. Thomas and I have allocated a couple of $100 for the Everett campus, a couple of $1,000 for some of the larger campuses to start this process now. It's only a 2-year grant cycle, so we're going to see what we can do, and so we don't expect to be able to work miracles in 2 years, but we do hope to put in some infrastructure. At the same time, this is supplementing what the Pullman students have done, which is a fundamental needs $5 student fee, which goes to the Cougar Food Pantry on the Pullman campus. That means that they have been able to staff with things like fresh produce and just a number of other great things that you don't normally see in pantries. So that's been very great. We also are going to need to run the 2022 fundamental needs survey, which will be statewide. So Dr. Thomas mentioned the Real College survey from 2019. This new version of the survey is actually the same one that everyone in the state receiving the grant is supposed to be running. So we're going to try to figure out the best way to time that, but it should give us a better picture of what's happening for our students system-wide at WSU. And then I think there was one other comment I wanted to make, and now I can't remember it. So, actually, I have it right in front of me. I did want to share 2 stories of students who would be supported by this type of environment and this type of grant. So we had a student who moved to Pullman in the fall of 2020 because their living situation was unsafe. They actually had a person in their permanent home life who had threatened their life and the life of their pet. And so they needed to leave immediately, but they needed to leave without any other infrastructure in their life in place. They wanted to sign a lease on an apartment in Pullman, which we were able to connect them with an apartment resource. But that apartment needed a month's rent in order to move in, and that student didn't have access to that. So this type of grant, we'd be able to supplement that and help them get into that apartment. We also connected them with our Community Action Center in Pullman, which is a really great community-based resource, helps with all sorts of fundamental needs for the larger Whitman County area. And then ultimately, we were able to accommodate them through WSU student housing. So that's one example. Another is we had a student who had been living in their residence hall for a full year. And then right before the end of the spring semester, their family told them they were not able to return to their permanent address. They just were simply not invited to live in that environment anymore. It was a surprise to that student. It was a very, very scary moment, as you can imagine. And they also needed an emergency job. They needed a place to live. They needed access to food. And they're unfortunately not the only stories that we have of students in these positions. We've also seen this happen for LGBTQ students who have come out to their families and they're not welcome to go home anymore. Or we have students who are college students exiting foster care who have never had that safety net in the form of kind of that permanent address. And so we're trying to put the infrastructure in place for students who have largely been invisible and make visible spaces and accessible spaces for all of them.
How are you going to conduct the survey? I mean, is it mail or, I mean, it's homeless, that could be.
Probably Qualtrics. We're working on that right now. We'll be working with our institutional review team in order to figure out the best way to initiate that. And we're also trying to avoid survey fatigue. In the spring, we also initiate a number of other large student surveys.
Right.
So we're going to try to figure that out. But spring 22 is the target date. Okay. The hard part about doing paper surveys is that students who don't have a permanent address are not going to be the ones who get them.
Yeah. As I was saying, that was dumb. Yeah. Right.
But we do know all of our students have access to a computer through the Peer Labs, and they're supposed to be checking the WSU email, so, in theory.
I'm curious, can you tell me anything about opportunities? You just talked a little bit about it for involvement within communities, and I'm thinking of in the Vancouver area, Janus Youth Programs that serves youth experiencing homelessness. I think their age range maybe just dropped a little bit. They used to be through 24. I think they might be through 18 now, or they're funded through multiple grants. And there was one other one that I was, gosh, what is it called? It's through the Y, but it's for youth exiting foster care. I don't remember the name of it. But can you tell me anything about those connections that you're thinking about or opportunities for that?
Yeah, we're actually hoping that this person that we hire, that will be part of their portfolio to make those connections and build into the communities. We're also only hiring one human being.
Right.
So that's a lot to put on that person's plate when they first start. And so one of the things we're hoping they will do is assess what else are we missing and where else do we need for resources. But we haven't gotten as far as labeling those specific community resources other than the ones that I think our student affairs teams already work with to get our students needs met.
And that would also include our passport resources that exist on many of our campuses, and that there are staff who work within there. So in terms of the connection and recruitment opportunities and encouraging many of those students who are aging out of or graduating high school from foster youth, that they have access to these funds and resources to go to college. This is also ideally and hopefully a start, that this serves as a central bit of info. And once we collect this data and are able to show what we can do with a little bit of funds, the idea is to go back out and say, okay, we did this amount with this little bit of dollars. What can we do with these dollars? And how do we sustain it? And how do we outreach and show that impact for our community and for these communities that clearly our legislature is invested in helping? And so I thank and congratulate the folks who brought this to our legislators years ago to invest in these dollars. And if we're able to report back some successes to those same folks, the idea is that they will vote to continue said programs and possibly extend.
Sorry, one more question. You said funding for a portion of the professional staff. So is this being matched by other funds?
Yeah, we have a couple of pockets where the money is coming from. Part of this person's portfolio will include working with the student food pantry in the Pullman campus. So part of that $5 fee that I mentioned earlier will go towards this position, as well as some very generous funds from the vice president's budget. So again, we've only got a 2-year cycle to try to get it all set up. So we'll see what we can accomplish in 18 months really at this point.
Yeah, that's a big job to be. I'm just thinking about each community on each campus, and the one person, that's a lot of connecting and.
Yeah, that was a lot.
So if you know any good candidates, that should be opening really soon.
And I'll tell you, I want to click back in the peer-to-peer piece.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that they are hiring and managing remotely some staff who are here in Vancouver, here in Everett, student staff, who are at each campus and really can get to know some of those localized resources and be a resource physically for students as they engage in their campus. And that whether it's a weekly staff meeting, remote and Zoom, like we've all got used to, and some of that training and some of that specific regional resources. And you're talking about the Y and some of those local resources. Those are some of the things that we hope to get out of that peer-to-peer and having that one person that's based in Pullman, that we are able to really work to educate our staff, our student staff on those different regions and what exists in the area.
This is really great. I personally keep thinking back to the Land Grant Foundation, right, and serving students who are experiencing homelessness or who have been maybe more at risk of homelessness or exiting foster care. It just seems like this is really in alignment with that foundation. So, great work.
I'm hoping by the next time you have a meeting, we'll have that person in place.
No, great. Yeah. This is really good information, but also I'm very grateful that we're providing this. I mean, obviously, you can wish you can have a lot more, but I mean, just the fact that we're doing this at all is so important.
And this is supplementing our already existing Student Emergency Grant Program. So currently, students can receive up to $500 in a semester and $1,000 in the lifetime of their career for an emergency that they might be experiencing. So for example, if a student experienced loss of their home because of natural disaster or fire, and maybe they lost their laptop as a result, we will be able to help supplement the purchase of a new laptop. Or we've also had students who, for some reason, couldn't afford textbooks, or had a family emergency and they needed to go home very suddenly and they weren't expecting to. We have those in place already, and this just helps bolster that infrastructure too.
And I'll speak to some of the federal dollars, the HERF funds, what were the other acronyms that were?
It's all from the HERO Act.
Yeah, there's a new act every couple months that is supporting students in that way. And we've taken many of those dollars and distributed them in an emergency funding type of way. I anticipate that those dollars will not always be there for students in this way. And so at least students that fit within those categories that we outlined can continue to utilize the resources. And with those resources that have been made available federally over the last couple of years, many of those students have raised their hand and said, I need this help. So we're becoming more aware, and students are also becoming aware of some of those emergency resources that exist. So the idea would be to piggyback in that same manner through the Maxine Forum, all the things they've utilized over the last 18 months, that we would continue that for this column of students, these columns of students who fit within it, and that it's seamless in some way to them, so that we have those students who are utilizing those resources already. And then when they raise their hand and say, hey, really all I need is some storage stuff because of downsizing, I'm moving in, so on and so forth, we can connect them with a resource navigator, and then not only meet that need of the storage unit, for example, but also have that resource navigator follow up and say, hey, have you thought about SNAP benefits? Or, I see that you are also a former foster youth. I see that this, and then they can get connected in ways they hadn't really thought about because they were just thinking about this one issue of storage or whatever it may be. And we've now kind of thought about that whole picture and help that student in that way. That's the idea.
We don't have a way of measuring this, but I want to emphasize something that Dr. Thomas said earlier. The federal protections for eviction moratoriums end in January of 2022, which is just 2 months from now. We don't know how many students are going to be in positions that are very behind in rent and where landlords are going to start taking action. We just don't have a way of gathering that information. But I expect at least some students to come forward and disclose that that's their situation. So we've got some things on the table coming.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation and your work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I know that today's committee meeting, that because our colleagues over in athletics, I know they had some things they were going to present, and that got moved to the January meeting, and so we had a little more time to dig into this, maybe a little more deeply than we would otherwise. So I know we're probably planning to end a little bit early, but appreciate the chance to dig in maybe a little more deeply and richly than we sometimes get the time to do in these meetings.
Yeah. No, it's great.
Thank you for bringing answers to questions I had last year.
You asked that question and I immediately made it. I said, yep, November, we're gonna get back to that one. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Okay, I believe we are finished with our committee meeting today. Thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Yes.
No, it was very good.